Section 12 of My Strange Rescue. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Strange Rescue by James Macdonald Oxley. Section 12. The Canadian Children of the Cold. After centuries of seclusion and neglect, broken only by the infrequent visits of ambitious seekers for the North Pole, or mercenary hunters for the right whale, and by the semi-religious, semi-commercial ministrations of the Moravian missionaries, the Eskimos of the Labrador and Hudson Bay region suddenly had the eyes of the world turned inquiringly upon them. The shocking story was published far and wide that a winter that did not change to spring in the usual way had cut off their supply of food, and that in consequence they were devouring one another with the ghastly relish of a Fiji cannibal. Although this report proved untrue, happily, the Eskimos are sufficiently interested to attract attention at all times, and are little enough known to furnish an adequate excuse at this time for a brief paper upon them. 1. To aid me in presenting the earliest glimpses of the Eskimos, I am fortunate in having before me a manuscript prepared by the late Robert Morrow of Halifax, Nova Scotia, an accomplished student of the literatures of Iceland and Denmark. That to the Norsemen and not to the Spaniards rightfully belongs the credit of first discovering America is now settled, and that when the Norsemen first touched American soil, they found the Eskimos already in possession is also certain. Yet it was not these bold adventurers that gave these curious people the name by which they are most commonly known. In the expressive Norse tongue, they were described as Skrælings, that is, the chips parings. The intention was not, of course, to convey the idea that they were cordially accepted as chips of the old block, but, on the contrary, to show that they were regarded by their handsome and stalwart discoverers as little better than mere fragments of humanity, a view which, however unflattering, their squat stature, ugly countenances, and filthy habits went far to justify. The name Eskimo was given to them by the Abenaki, a tribe of Indians in southern Labrador. It is an abbreviation of Eskimautsek, which means eating raw fish, in allusion to the repulsive custom of eating both fish and flesh without taking the preliminary trouble of cooking it. The Eskimos themselves assert very emphatically that they are Intuit, that is, the people, just as though they were the only people in the world. And, by the way, it is worth noticing that each particular tribe of these huskies think itself the entire population of the globe, until undeceived by the advent of visitors. Their national name, if they have one at all, is Karalit, the plural of Karalik, meaning those that stay behind. With reference to this latter title, Mr. Morrow points out a curious fact, which is suggestive. Strahlenberg, in his description of the northern part of Asia, states, on the authority of the Tartar writer Abulgazi Chan, that Og, or August Chan, who reigned in Tartary long before the birth of Christ, made an inroad into the southern Asiatic countries, and as some of his tribes stayed behind, they were called in reproach Kal-Atsi, and also Karalik. Now this Karalik, with its plural Klaralit, is the very name that the Eskimos gave themselves, so striking a resemblance, amounting in fact to identity, can surely be accounted for in no other way, and for this suggestion I must assume all responsibility, than that those who stayed behind in Tartary subsequently moved over to the American continent. When Eric the Red sailed across from Iceland to Greenland, somewhere about the year 985, he found many traces of the Eskimos there, and when Thorvald, some 20 years later, ventured as far south as Vinland, identified as the present Martha's Vineyard, with which he was so delighted that he exclaimed, "Here is a beautiful land, and here I wish to raise my dwelling." The unexpected discovery of 3 skin boats upon the beach affected him and his followers much as the imprint of a human foot did Robinson Crusoe. They found more than the boats, however, for each boat held 3 men, all but one of whom they caught and summarily dispatched, for reasons that the saga discreetly forbears to state. But retribution followed fast. No sooner had the invaders returned to their ships than the Skraelings attacked them in great force, and although the Norsemen came out best in the fighting, their leader, Thorvald, received a mortal wound. He charged his men to bury him upon the cape, at which he had thought it best to dwell, for, as he pathetically added, "It may happen that it was a true word that fell from my mouth that I should dwell here for a time." His men did as they were bid. They set up 2 crosses over his grave, whose site is now known as Summit Point. They then hastened homeward. After the lapse of 2 years, one Thorwin Karlsefori, fired by what he heard in Iceland of the wonderful discoveries made by the hardy sons of Eric the Red, fitted out an imposing expedition. His boats carried 160 men, besides women, cattle, etc., and set sail for Vinland. He reached his destination in safety, and, remaining there for some time, improved upon his predecessor's method of treating the Skraelings. Instead of aimlessly killing them, he cheerfully cheated them, getting huge packs of furs in exchange for bits of red cloth. He has thus described his customers' chief characteristics: "These men were black and ill-favored, and had straight hair on their heads. They had large eyes and broad cheeks." All of which shows that, although the Eskimos have changed their habitat since then, they have not altered much in their appearance. After 2 years of prosperous trading, the relations between the Norsemen and the Skraelings became strained from a cause too amusing not to be related. As already stated, the visitors brought a few of their cattle with them, and it happened one day that a huge bull had his feelings excited some way or other, perhaps by a piece of red cloth thoughtlessly paraded in his views. At all events, he bellowed very loud, and charging upon the terrified Eskimos, tossed them about in the most lively fashion. They incontinently tumbled into their boats, and without a word of farewell rowed off, to the vast amusement of the bull's owners. But the latter's laughter vanished when presently the runaways returned in whole ranks like a rushing stream, and began an attack in which the Norsemen were vanquished by sheer force of numbers, and deemed it prudent to make off without standing upon the order of their growing. 2. With the departure of the Norsemen, the curtain of obscurity falls upon the Eskimos, and is not lifted again until we find them, not luxuriating amid the vine-entangled forests of Vinland, but scattered far and wide over the hideous desolation of the far north, and engaged in a ceaseless struggle with hunger and cold. Just when they thus moved northward, and why, does not yet appear. If their innate and intense hatred of the Red Indian be of any service as a clue, it is, however, within the bounds of reason to believe that they were driven from their comfortable quarters by their more active and warlike fellow aborigines, and given no rest until they found it amidst the icebergs and glaciers of Labrador and Hudson Bay, where they may now be met with in bands numbering from a dozen to 100 or more. Throughout the whole of this Arctic region they fearlessly range in search of food. The Eskimos are, in fact, the only inhabitants of a vast territory which includes the shores of Arctic America, the whole of Greenland, and a tract about 400 miles long on the Asiatic coast beyond Bering Strait, thus extending over a distance of 5,000 miles from east to west, and 3,200 miles from north to south. Notwithstanding this wide distribution, there is a remarkable uniformity, not only in the physical features of the Eskimos, but also in their manners, traditions, and language. Consequently, very much that may be said of the Canadian children of the cold, that is, the Eskimos of Labrador and Hudson Bay, would be equally true of the other branches of the race. For a great deal of interesting information concerning them we are indebted to the writings of such men as Ribach and Hertzberg, Moravian missionaries, who, with a heroic zeal that only those familiar with their lot can adequately appreciate, have devoted themselves to the cure of souls among the Eskimos. There are 6 of these Moravian missions scattered along the eastern coast of Labrador. Nain, the chief one, was established as far back as 1771, Okak in 1776, Hopedale in 1782, and Hebron, Zor, and Ramah more recently. The bestowal of so attractive biblical names helps very little, however, to mitigate the unfavorable impression produced by the forbidding surroundings of these tiny oases, almost lost in a seemingly illimitable desert. Sheer from the sea, except where broken by frequent gulf and fiord, the coastline towers up in tremendous and unpitying sternness, and at its base the breakers thunder with a force and fury that knows little pause throughout the year. From end to end the shore is jagged like a gigantic saw, with innumerable bays and inlets, sprinkled thick with islands and underlaid with hidden reefs, which makes these waters difficult to find and dangerous to navigate. The interior of the country is equally repellent, although toward the west it becomes less mountainous and slightly undulating like the American prairie. It presents nothing but an inhospitable and savage wilderness, covered with immense forests, broken by numerous swamps and lakes, and untouched by human foot, save when now and then a band of red Indians venture thither, lured by the hope of food and fur. The Eskimos upon the eastern coast of Labrador are, as a rule, small of stature, not much exceeding 5 feet. Those upon the western shore, however, are taller and more robust. They are quite strongly built, with hair and beard sweeping down over the shoulders and chest. When the good seed sown by the patient missionary finds lodging in a husky's heart, he usually signalizes his adoption of Christianity by indulging in a clean shave, or at least by cutting his beard short with a pair of scissors, in deference perhaps to the judgment of St. Paul that "if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him." They have small, soft hands, broad shoulders, big, flat faces, large, round heads, and short, stubby noses, tip-tilted like the petals of a flower, and very generous mouths, which begin nearly always on the broad grin, make free display of fine rows of sharp white teeth. In complexion they are tawny and ruddy, and the face is of a much darker shade than the body. At springtime, when the sun's burning rays are reflected from glistening banks of snow, they become almost black in face as negroes, but newborn babes may be seen as fair as any English child. Their eyes are small and almost uniformly black, and peep brightly out at you from underneath a perfect forest of brow and lash. Their hair is black also, and very thick and coarse. Their ordinary food is the flesh of the seal with its attendant blubber, and the fish that abound along the shore. They are not particular whether their dinner is cooked or not, and I seriously question whether a professional pugilist in the height of his training could swallow his beefsteak as rare as the Eskimos will their seal cutlets. They are also very partial to tallow, soap, fish oil, and such things, which they look upon as great delicacies, a big tallow candle being rather more of a treat to an Eskimo youngster than a stick of candy to a civilized small boy. That these peculiar and decidedly repulsive tastes are, after all, bottomed on the laws of nature is clearly shown by the fact that when the natives around a mission station adopt a European diet, and they soon become passionately fond of bread and biscuits, they inevitably grow weak and incapable of standing the intense cold. When Joe, that heroic Eskimo who supported Hall's expedition by his hunting, after Hall himself had died, was transplanted to America and thence to England, he soon languished and grew consumptive, despite every effort to preserve his health. On joining Captain Young in the Pandora, his only remark, uttered with a depth of eager, confident hope that was very touching, was, by and by get little seal meat, then all right. A prediction that was fulfilled to the very letter when he regained his native ice. As soon as they killed their first seal, Joe was given free rein, and he began to revive at once. His hollow cheeks resumed their old-time chubbiness, and smeariness too, no doubt. His languor left him, and he was, in short, another man. The seal is, in fact, everything to the Eskimo. What the buffalo was to the American Indian, what the reindeer is to the European Laplander, all that, and still more, is the seal to these children of the cold. Upon its meat and blubber they feed. With its fur they are clothed. By its oil they are warmed and lighted. Stretched upon appropriate framework, its skin makes them seaworthy boats and weatherproof tents. While unkindest use of all, with its bladder they float the fatal harpoon that wrought its own undoing. To sum it all up in one sentence, take away the seal, and the Eskimo could not exist for a month. There is not much room for fashion's imperious sway in Labrador. Sealskin from scalp to toe is the invariable rule, and there would be no small difficulty in distinguishing between the sexes if the women did not indulge in a certain amount of ornamentation upon their garments, and further indicate their femininity by appending to their sacques a curious tail reaching almost to the ground, which they renew whenever it becomes so dirty as to shock even their sluggish sensibilities. Still another distinguishing mark, permissible, however, only to those who attain the dignity of motherhood, is the amuk, a capacious hood hung between the shoulders, which forms the safest and snuggest of all carrying places for babies that otherwise would be in arms. 3. Seal hunting. In addition to the records of the Moravian missionaries, the reports of the Arctic explorers, and the stories brought back by whalers concerning the Eskimos, much information has been gained of late through the measures taken by the Canadian government to determine the practicability of Hudson Bay as a commercial highway. For 3 successive years, expeditions on an extensive scale have been dispatched to that little-known region, and observing stations have been maintained throughout the year at different points along the coast of Labrador and the shores of that great inland sea, which has not inappropriately been termed the Mediterranean of Canada. As one result of these expeditions, much attention has been drawn to the natives. Lieutenant Gordon, who has commanded all 3, has many kind words for them. He finds them docile, amiable, and willing to work, and apparently much pleased with the prospect of increased intercourse with the white man. Occasionally one is met that has been sufficiently enterprising to acquire the English language, while many others understand well enough what is said to them in that language, although they cannot be persuaded to speak it. They are wildly fond of any article of civilized clothing, and the head man at one settlement exhibited no little pride in the possession of the stand-up linen collar, almost worthy to be placed beside one of Mr. Gladstone's. Although he displayed it to the utmost advantage, he did not, like the Fiji chieftain, consider all other clothing superfluous. When stores were being landed at the stations, the Eskimos would gather about and offer their services, which were always accepted, and then all day long they would toil cheerfully side by side with their white brethren, requiring no other remuneration than biscuits. When so much had been written by Arctic explorers about the incorrigible kleptomania of the natives, it is no less a matter for surprise than for gratification that Lieutenant Gordon can bear this testimony as to the moral status of the Eskimos at Hudson Bay. One word may be said in regard to their honesty. Although scraps of iron and wood possess a value to them which we can hardly appreciate, they would take nothing without first asking leave. Not even a chip or broken nail was taken without their first coming to ask permission of the officer who was on duty. No doubt the fact that practical prohibition prevails has something to do with this highly commendable showing. The law, aided and abetted by the vigilant missionaries, shuts out everything stronger than lime juice, and the path of the Eskimo is free from the most seductive and destructive of all temptations, except when some unprincipled whaler offers him a pull out of his flask. This, however, is a rare occurrence, and there is no record of any such disturbance ever having been raised as would, in more highly civilized communities, call for the interference of the police. Although the simplicity of their life and their freedom from many modern vices conduce to longevity, these advantages are more than counterbalanced by the strain put upon their constitutions by the severity of the climate and the incessant struggle for food. Consequently, they soon age, and seldom live beyond 60 years. The doctrine that cleanliness is next to godliness finds few adherents in Eskimo land. The rule seems to be to eschew washing throughout the year, and many a mightier hunter goes through life innocent of a bath, unless, indeed, he should happen to be tumbled out of his kayak by some irate walrus with other than sanitary designs in mind. Mr. Tuttle, the historian of the first Hudson Bay expedition, is authority for the statement that the children, when very young, are sometimes cleaned by being licked with their mother's tongue before being put into the bag of feathers that serves them as bed, cradle, and blanket. But one cannot help thinking that this particular version of a lick and a promise is rather too laborious to have extensive vogue. So familiar has the world been made through the medium of Arctic exploration literature with the igloos, huts, kayaks, and umiaks boats, sledges, dogs, harpoons, and other possessions of these people, which are precisely the same wherever they may be found, that reference to them seems unnecessary, especially as the Canadian Eskimos offer nothing peculiar. But before concluding, a few words must be added as to the intellectual and moral characteristics of the race. Their intelligence is considerable. In some instances they display not only a taste, but a talent for music, chart making, and drawing. One case is mentioned where a mere lad drew an excellent outline of the coast for over 100 miles, indicating its many irregularities with astonishing accuracy. They are capital mimics, and are apt at learning the songs and dances of their white visitors. but they are poor men of business. They generally leave to the purchaser the fixing of the price of anything they have to sell. It is said that in their private lives their state of morality is low, although they avoid indecency calculated to give public offense. Stealing and lying were unknown among them until these black arts were introduced by the whites as products of civilization, and, unhappily, the natives are proving apt pupils. They are also somewhat given to gambling. Although by no means without courage, they seldom quarrel, and never go to war with one another. As to religion, the Eskimos, before they accepted Christianity, had little or none that was worthy of the name. They believe in the immortality of the soul, but liberally extend this document to the lower animals also, which they endow with souls. They hold also that human souls can pass into the bodies of these very animals. With respect to the higher powers, their creed is that the world is ruled by supernatural beings whom they call owners, and as almost every object has its owner, this would seem to be a kind of pantheism. After death, human souls go either up or down, but in curious contrast to the belief of all other races, the good, in their opinion, go to the nether world, where they bask in a land not of milk and honey, but of inexhaustible seal meat and blubber. The bad, on the other hand, go to the upper world, where they suffer what a fashionable preacher euphemized as eternal uneasiness, not from excess of heat, but from frost and famine. There they are permitted to lighten their misery by playing ball with a walrus head, which diversion, by the way, in some inexplicable fashion, gives rise to the aurora borealis. Like all aborigines, they have their own legend of the deluge, and to this day they proudly point out a large island lying between Okak and Hebron, rising to the height of nearly 7,000 feet, which they claim was the only spot left uncovered by the flood, and upon which a select party of their antediluvian ancestors survived the otherwise all-embracing catastrophe. The future destination of this interesting race may be readily forecast. In common with the red Indian of the plains, the swarthy Eskimo may adopt, with reference to the white man, those words of fathomless pathos uttered by John the Baptist in reference to the Messiah: "He must increase, but I must decrease." It is merely a question of time. All over the vast region he inhabits are signs showing that his numbers were far greater once than they are at present. The insatiable greed of his white brothers is rendering his existence increasingly difficult. The seal and the walrus are ever being driven farther north, and that means a sterner and shorter struggle for life. As the Indian will not long survive the buffalo, so the Eskimo will not long survive the seal. There are perhaps 15,000 of them now scattered far and wide over the tremendous spaces between Labrador and Alaska. Each year their numbers are growing less, and ere long the last remnants of the race will have vanished, and the great lone North will return to the state of appalling solitude and silence that only the Canadian children of the cold had the fortitude to alleviate by their presence. End of section 12. Section 13 of My Strange Rescue. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shasta, Oakland, California. My Strange Rescue by James Macdonald Oxley. Section 13. Face to face with an Indian devil. There were 3 of us, and we were all untiring explorers of the forests and streams within reach of our homes, in quest of such possessors of fur, fin, or feather as our guns and rods could overcome. Plenty of luck did we have, too, for we lived in a sparsely settled part of Nova Scotia, and the trout and partridges and rabbits had not had their ranks thinned by too much hunting. It was no uncommon thing for us to bring back, as the result of an afternoon's whipping of the brooks, 2 or 3 dozen speckled trout, weighing from half a pound to 3 pounds each, while less than a dozen brace of plump partridges or bob-tailed rabbits was looked on as a very poor bag for a day's shooting. Adventurous and enterprising as we were, however, one stream of which we had knowledge remained undisturbed by our lines. It was known among the Micmacs, a band of whom roamed about the neighborhood, as Indian Devil Run, being so called because of their belief that the dense, dark forest in which it took its rise was the fastness of a family of panthers, of which they stood in great dread. Nor was the name without good foundation, for one autumn a hunter with a gun and trap ventured into this place, and returned with the body of a panther, stating that he believed others still remained. Indian Devil Run began somewhere in the North Forest, ran through its heavy shadows for several miles, and then appeared to add its contribution to the Digdequash River, at which point we made its acquaintance. We often talked about following it up into the depths of the forest, but the Indian stories made us pause, until at last one evening in September, Jack Johnston, craving some fresh excitement, dared us to make the attempt, and we rashly accepted the challenge. The following morning we set off, letting no one know the object of our expedition. We were armed in this fashion. Charlie Peters bore an ancient Dutch musket, warranted, when properly loaded, to kill at both ends. Johnston had a keen tomahawk, which the Indians had taught him to use like one of themselves, and I carried an old-fashioned smooth-bore shotgun, dangerous only to small game. "Now, if we come across an Indian devil, Charlie," said Johnston, "you give him a broadside from Dutchy, and I'll finish him with my tomahawk." "And where do I come in?" I asked with a smile. "You? Oh, you blaze away at him with your pepper pot. You might perhaps put his eyes out, you know," Jack laughingly responded, and so our order of battle was settled upon. We crossed the Digdequash in a canoe, hid our craft in the underbrush, and in high feather entered upon the exploration of Indian Devil Run. It proved to be a succession of falls and rapids, overshadowed by huge trees for several miles, and we had hard work making our way up its course. But we toiled steadily on, and just before midday were rewarded for our pains by reaching a lovely spot where the banks of the stream widened to form an enchanting pond, encircled by a meadow, and offering every inducement to stay and rest. Glad we were to do so. The pond evidently swarmed with trout. Quickly adjusting our fishing tackle, we got to work. Shade of Isaac Walton! What a paradise for anglers! The water fairly boiled as the hungry trout fought for the privilege of being hooked. In 1 hour we landed as many as we could carry home, and they were fine fellows, every one of them. "The greatest place for trout I ever struck!" exclaimed Charlie Peters, throwing down his rod. "I positively haven't the heart to catch any more. It seems like taking a mean advantage of them." So we stopped the slaughter, apparently much to the disappointment of our prey, who hung about asking to be made victims, and proceeded to dispose of the ample lunch with which our thoughtful mothers had provided us. Then we had a refreshing plunge in the clear water, scaring the trout nearly out of their skins, and by this time it was necessary that we should retrace our steps. On our way up, I had brought down a fine brace of birds, and to save carrying them to and fro, we had hung them to a high branch, intending to pick them up on the return journey. "Don't forget your partridges, Hal," said Jack to me, as we shouldered our bags heavy with trout. "No fear of that," I replied. "I know exactly where I left them." Hitherto we had seen and heard nothing to justify the Indians' superstitious dread of the locality. No signs of wild animals were visible, and in high spirits at having discovered so rich a fishing ground, we hastened homeward. "I guess the Indian devils have got tired of this place and left," remarked Charlie Peters, "but don't let us give it away all the same. We must keep this run all to ourselves as long as we can." Hardly had he spoken when an appalling shriek pierced the silence of the woods, and brought us to a sudden stop. While we looked into one another's faces with apprehension, we made no attempt to conceal. We were close to the tree where the partridges had been hung. "It's the Indian devil!" exclaimed Jack Johnston under his breath. "He's eaten the partridges, and now he wants to eat us." We fully realized our danger, and after the first shock of fright, braced ourselves to meet it with a determined front. Johnston, as the eldest and coolest of the three, took command. "Charlie," he said, "you must let him have Dutchy full in the face the moment we sight him. Hal, you blaze away with your shotgun, and I'll stand by to finish him with my tomahawk." Nodding assent to these directions, we stood side by side, gazing eagerly into the forest gloom. "There he is," said Johnston. "See, on that big limb." We followed the direction of his finger, and saw the brute clearly enough, stretched upon a limb not 12 yards away, his great green eyes glaring horribly at us. "Quick, Charlie!" cried Jack. "He's going to spring. Rest your gun on my shoulder and aim for his chest." Charlie did as he was bid, and pulled the trigger. Bang went the old musket, with a tremendous report. Over went Charlie on his back, his shoulder well nigh dislocated by the kick of his weapon, and down came the panther to the ground, badly wounded in his neck and breast. The instant he touched ground, I let him have it with the contents of my shotgun, but they only served to bother him for a moment, and looking terrible in his fury, he was just gathering himself for a spring into our midst, when Johnston, stepping forward, sent his tomahawk whizzing through the air with all the force of his strong right arm. It was a perfect throw. No Micmac could have done it better. Like a flash of lightning, the bright steel blade went straight to its mark, and buried itself in the panther's forehead, right between those awful eyes, whose malignant gleam it extinguished forever. Lifting Charlie to his feet, we rushed forward, and stood in triumph over our fallen foe, shaking hands across his mighty body. How our hearts swelled with pride at the thought of a sensation our exploit would make. With a twisted withe for a rope, we laboriously dragged our prize to the canoe, and so got it across the river. Here we met the Indian who had been Johnston's teacher in the art of tomahawk throwing. He seemed immensely relieved to see us. "Me see you boys go over this morning, then hear devil scream this afternoon, and hear you go bang. Me 'fraid you all deaded this time." Then, as he discovered the fatal gash in the brute's head, his face lit up with pride. "Johnston, you do that!" he cried. "Ah, smart boy! Me learn you how throw tomahawk like that." Jack blushingly acknowledged the fact, and gave his Indian instructor due meed of praise for having taught him so well. It was too big a job to get the heavy carcass of the panther any further, so the Indian took off the head and skin for us, and we presented him with the body, which he said was good to eat, and would make Indian strong. Our arrival at home, with the trophies of our triumph over the terror of the forest, caused great rejoicing. We were the heroes of the hour, and Charlie quite forgot his bruised shoulder in the pleasant excitement of the occasion. We often revisited Indian Devil Run after that, and took many a fine fare of fish from its well-stocked waters, but we never saw another panther. We had apparently killed the last of the brood. End of section 13.
Section 14 of My Strange Rescue. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Strange Rescue by James Macdonald Oxley. Section 14. In the Nick of Time. "Will you be out to practice this evening, Charlie?" asked Rob Mackenzie of his friend Kent, as the two who had been walking home from the high school together parted at a corner. "Indeed, that I will," was the reply. "And every evening, too, until the match comes off. It'll take all the practice we can put in to beat those Riverside chaps, I can tell you." "Pshaw! What makes you think they'll be so hard to beat this time?" returned Rob. "We've always had our fair share of the game so far." "So we have, but they didn't have Sam Massie playing with them." "Sam Massie? Who's Sam Massie?" exclaimed Rob in surprise. "Don't you know who Sam Massey is? Why, he's one of the first 12 of the Torontos," replied Charlie, looking somewhat astonished at his friend's ignorance. "Then how on earth can he play with the Riversides?" asked Rob. "Can't we protest?" "Oh, that's all right enough. His uncle lives in Riverside, and he's staying with him for a while, so we can't object to his playing." "Humph!" growled Rob. "It's a pity we can't. We've got nobody to match him." "I don't think it's a pity at all," returned Charlie cheerfully. "I'd a good deal rather see a crack player like Sam Massey and get some points from him than object to his playing, even if he gains the match for the other fellows. We'll do our best to give him a good day's work anyway, so let's practice hard." And Charlie went off whistling. There was an intense rivalry between the villages of Riverside and Heatherton in the matter of lacrosse. Each village had a good club, in which not only the players but the people also took a hearty interest, and the matches that were played once a month alternately in each village during the season never failed to draw out to see them everybody in the population that could possibly manage to be present. They were always played on Saturday, because then the farmers from round about came into the village to do their week's business early in the morning, and by rushing things a little could easily get through by 3 o'clock. Then they and the shopkeepers and the rest of the village folk would adjourn to the lacrosse field and have a lively time of it, shouting and cheering and laughing as the game went on before them. Charlie Kent and Rob Mackenzie were the two youngest members of the Heatherton Lacrosse 12, and they naturally felt very proud of their position, which they had won by proving themselves the best players in the high school, and thereby attracting the attention of the Heatherton captain quite early in the season. The day when big Tom Brown called them both aside and invited them to play with the first 12 was one of the proudest in their lives, and Tom had had no reason to regret his invitation on any game that summer, for the two young cubs, as he called them, proved themselves very useful additions, being quick, careful, plucky, and best of all, thoroughly obedient, always doing exactly what he told them. The next match with Riverside was of special importance, because it would be the final and decisive one of 5 which the two clubs were playing for a fine set of silk flags, which had been offered as a trophy by some generous friends of lacrosse in both villages. Each club had won 2 matches, and now on the approaching Saturday the 5th and final match would take place, rain or shine. The rumour of Sam Massey being with the Riversides had reached Heatherton early in the week, and caused no little concern, some of the players being disposed to make a protest if he appeared on the field, and even a refusal to play. But Tom Brown would not listen to them. Sam Massey was, for the time being at least, a resident in Riverside, and to object to his playing would be acting in a way he did not approve of. So the dissatisfied ones were fain to hold their tongues. The eventful Saturday came, and was as fine as heart could wish. It was Heatherton's turn to have the match, and the home team rejoiced at this, because it would in some measure compensate them for the advantage their opponents undoubtedly possessed in having Sam Massey with them. Never before had so large a crowd assembled to watch the match. It really seemed as if half the population of Riverside and 3/4 of the population of Heatherton had turned out. The whole field was surrounded with a fringe of spectators, ready to applaud every good point in the game. In due time the Riverside team made their appearance, looking very jaunty in their blue jerseys, caps and stockings, and white knickerbockers, and all eyes were turned upon them to discover the redoubtable Sam Massey. It was easy to distinguish him from the others, and he certainly was a dangerous-looking player. He was not of more than medium size, but the perfection of his condition, the graceful ease and quickness of his movements, and the unfailing accuracy of his catching and throwing, as the team indulged in the usual preliminary exercise, impressed everybody with the idea that he fully merited his reputation. Charlie Kent's place was centre field, his quickness and steadiness entitling him to that important position, while Rob Mackenzie was the next man between him and the opponent's goal. Charlie was very anxious to see where the Riversides would put Massey, and was not at all sorry when that player took his place at cover point, for now he would be certain to cross sticks with him more than once during the match, and find out just how strong a man he was. Amid the breathless suspense of the spectators, the two teams lined up, were briefly adjured by the referee to indulge in no rough play or fouls, and then in pairs departed to their places, the white and blue of the Riversides contrasting picturesquely with the white and crimson of the Heathertons as the players strung out from goal to goal. "Are you all ready?" cried the referee. The captains nodded their heads. The two centre fields kneeled opposite one another for the face. The ball was placed between the lacrosse sticks, and with a shout of "Play!" the referee sprang aside, and the struggle began. There was a second scuffle between the two centres, and then the Heathertons raised a shout, for Charlie had got the ball away from his opponent, tipped it cleverly to Rob, who after a short run had thrown it to outside home, and the Riverside goal was in danger. But before outside home could do anything, Massey was down upon him with the swoop of an eagle. With a sharp check he knocked the ball off his stick, then picked it up at once and dashed away down the field, dodging in and out between his two opponents like a veritable eel. Not until he reached the Heatherton cover point was he obliged to stop, and then he took a shot at goal, which, but for the plucky goalkeeper putting his broad chest squarely in the way, would certainly have scored. Back the ball went, however, to the other goal, and continued thus to travel up and down for fully 15 minutes before some skilful passing and sharp dodging on the part of the Heathertons brought it in front of the Riverside goal, when, after a hard tussle, it was swiped through by a lucky stroke from Charlie Kent. Great was the elation of the Heathertons at scoring the first game. "Guess they're not invincible after all, if they have Sam Massey," said Charlie to Captain Brown. "Mustn't crow too soon, Charlie," replied Brown cautiously. "We've got the afternoon before us yet." When the Riversides, thanks to a brilliant run of Massey's, won the next game in 5 minutes, Charlie felt somewhat less confident. And when, after a severe struggle, then by a pure piece of luck took the third game in 20 minutes, he began to feel a little down in the mouth. But the winning of the fourth game by the Heathertons braced him up again, and he went into the fifth and final struggle with a brave and determined heart. The excitement had now become intense. It had been agreed before play commenced that the game should be called at 6 o'clock, and if not then finished, played over again at Riverside the following Saturday. The Heathertons fully appreciated the advantage of playing on their own ground, and were determined to settle the fate of the flags before 6 o'clock, if at all possible. The Riversides were equally determined to play out the time, if they could do nothing better. Accordingly, they concentrated all their strength upon the defence, and surrounded the redoubtable Sam Massey with the best men in the team. Once more Charlie Kent won the face, and again tipped to Rob, who did not fail to send it well down towards the goal. But the stone wall defence quickly sent it back. Again and again the rubber sphere went flying through the air, or bounding along the ground toward the Riverside goal, and again it returned, not even being permitted to stay there a moment. The minutes passed quickly, and 6 o'clock drew near. "Charlie, can't you and Rob manage to get that ball down between you? Never mind your places, just play for the goal," said Captain Brown earnestly to Charlie. "All right, Captain, we'll do our best," replied Charlie, as he passed the word to Rob. As luck would have it, the Riversides, grown bold by their success, opened out their defence just then, and moved nearer the Heatherton goal. Charlie's quick eye noted the change of tactics instantly. "Look sharp now, Rob," he called, and Rob nodded meaningly. A moment later the ball came flying his way, and springing high he caught it cleverly amid a howl of applause from the spectators. Then, signalling Rob to keep parallel with him, he dashed off at full speed towards the Riverside goal. Charlie was lightly built and long-winded, and constant practice had made him the fastest sprinter in Heatherton, but he had never run before as he had then. The onlookers held their breath to watch him as he sped on. 1, 2, 3 opponents were safely past by brilliant dodging, and now only Sam Massie stood between him and the goal. He knew it would be useless to try to dodge Sam, but there was a better play. Before Sam could reach him, he tipped the rubber over to Rob. Instantly Sam turned upon Rob, and brought his stick down upon Rob's with a resounding whack. But the ball was not there. Already it was rolling towards Charlie, who had continued straight on, and scooping it up from the ground with a straight, swift overhand throw, he sent it flying through the goal post just in time to allow the cry of "Goal! Goal!" to be triumphantly raised ere the 6 o'clock whistle sounded the hour for calling the game. Charlie Kent was, of course, the hero of the day. Sam Massie, brilliantly as he had played, was quite forgotten. But he did not forget to come up and clap Charlie warmly on the back, saying, "Bravo, my boy! You'll make a championship player some day. You must come up to Toronto. We want your kind up there." End of section 14.
Section 15 of My Strange Rescue. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. My Strange Rescue by James Macdonald Oxley. Snowshoeing. 3 things have the red children of the forest given to the white children of the cities, which are so perfect in their way that it is hardly possible there will ever be an invention filed in the pigeonholes of the Patent Office that will surpass them. The canoe for shallow water and what might be called cross-country navigation, the toboggan and the snowshoe for deep snow, seem to be the very crown of human ingenuity, even though they are only the devices of ignorant Indians. One cannot help a feeling of hearty admiration when looking at them, and noting how perfectly they fulfill the purpose for which they were designed, and are at the same time as light, graceful, and artistic in form and fashion as the most finished work of highly civilized folk. They all follow the line of beauty so closely that it is no wonder the ladies love to decorate their drawing rooms and boudoirs with them, or to have their pins and brooches modeled after them. To the Indian, the canoe, snowshoe, and toboggan were quite as important implements as the spade, the plow, and the rake are to the farmer. Without them he could not in winter time have roamed the snow-buried forests, whose recesses supplied his table, or voyaged in the summer time upon the broad rivers and swift-running streams, whose bountiful waters furnished him their ready toll of fish. His white brother has in adopting them put them to a different use. He had no particular need for them in his work, but he was quick to see how they would help him in his play, and ere long they had all 3 become favorite means of sport and recreation. Snowshoeing disputes with tobogganing the honor of being Canada's national winter sport, for although snowshoes have been seen in Siberia and Tartary, and are used to some extent in Scandinavia, in none of these places do the people derive much amusement from them. Simple as the snowshoe seems, I would not advise anyone to try to make a pair for himself. Only the Indians can do this really well, and even in Canada the vast majority of shoes are put together by dusky hands. This is how they make a shoe of 3 foot 6 inches, which is a fair average size. A piece of light ash about half an inch thick and at least 90 inches in length is bent to a long oval until the 2 ends touch, when they are lashed strongly together with catgut. 2 strips of tough wood about an inch broad are then fitted across this frame, one being placed about 5 inches from the curving top, the other some 20 inches from the tapering end. The object of these strips is to give both strength and spring to the shoe. The 3 sections into which the interior of the frame has thus been divided are then woven across with catgut, each having a different degree of fineness in the mesh, the top section being very fine, the middle section, upon which almost the whole strain comes, coarse and strong, and the end section a medium grade between the other two. The gut in the middle section is wound right around the framework, for the sake of greater strength, but in the other two is threaded through holes bored at intervals of an inch or so. Just behind the front crossbar an opening, about 4 inches square, is left in the gut netting, in order to allow free play for the toes in lifting the shoe at each step. Both wood and gut must be thoroughly seasoned, or else the one will warp, and the other stretch and sag until the shoe is altogether useless. The shoes are made in many shapes and of many sizes, ranging from 2 to 6 feet in length, and from 10 to 20 inches in breadth. But for all practical purposes, a shoe measuring 3 feet 6 inches by 12 or 15 inches is the best. In racing, narrower shoes are used, but they rarely go below 10 inches, that being the regulation measurement for club competitions. Then, again, some snowshoes are turned up in front like tiny toboggans, instead of being flat, this kind being worn principally by ladies. And now, supposing that we have a pair of shoes entirely to our satisfaction, let us constitute ourselves members of a snowshoe club, and take a tramp with it. Snowshoeing is immensely popular in Montreal, as all visitors to the winter carnival well know. There are 20 or more organized clubs there, the membership in most cases being rigidly confined to the masculine gender, and every fine night in the week, all winter long, some club or other has a meet. Discipline is pretty strictly enforced at these club tramps, and seeing how earnestly the members go about the business, an onlooker might well be pardoned for thinking that there was quite as much work as play in this particular amusement. The pace set and the distance traveled are beyond the powers of beginners, so that unless one is willing to stand a good deal of merciless chaffing and have a pretty hard time of it altogether, it is better to wait until fairly familiar with the use of the raquet, the French name for the snowshoe, before joining a club. Let us imagine, then, that it is one of those glorious nights in midwinter when this dull old earth of ours seems transformed into fairyland. The snow lies in white depths upon the ground, dry and firm as ocean sand. Jack Frost has brought the mercury away down some points below zero, and the keen air sets every nerve a-tingle. A superb full-orbed moon swings high in the heavens, flooding the wintry world with her silver splendor, and 100 active, muscular young fellows have gathered at the rendezvous, clothed in white blanket coats with rainbow borders, brilliant blue sashes, and toques, conical knitted caps sacred to snowshoeing, knickerbockers of the same material as the coats, and stockings of the same color as the sashes, while on their feet are soft moccasins, skillfully decorated by Indian fingers. Sharp on time the club captain arrives, and in a trice all hands are down upon their knees, fastening the raquet to their feet. "Are you all ready?" shouts the captain. A hearty chorus of "Aye, aye" rings out on the keen air. "Off, then," he answers, striding rapidly away, his followers stringing out in a long line behind, for the walking is always done in Indian file, and they set forth to attack the mountain, which towers up so grandly behind the city, forming one of the finest parks in the world. The line of march is made up very simply. The captain who is selected for that much coveted position because of his renown for speed and endurance, as well as his knowledge of the best routes, takes the lead. The rank and file follow in any order they please, and the rear is brought up by the whipper in. Although the post of whipper in is not much coveted, that officer ranks next in importance to the captain, and should be one of the strongest and most experienced members in the club. His really arduous duties are to quicken up the laggards, assist the unfortunate, and inspire the despondent, for upon him it depends to have the club all in together at the end of the tramp. Wending along the snow-covered, tree-bordered paths, or diving deep into the forest where there are no paths at all, the long thin line climbs steadily upward, growing longer as the steep ascent begins to tell upon the weaker ones, and they lag behind. At length the summit is reached, and a halt is called for a few minutes, that the panting, perspiring climbers may get their breath and close up the gaps in their ranks. "All up?" inquires the captain. "All up," is the cheery response. Then forward, and off they go again, this time down instead of up, with head thrown back, shoulders braced firmly, muscles at high tension, and eyes alert for dangers in the shape of hidden stumps or treacherous tree branches. Faster and faster grows the pace, as the impetus of the decline is more and more felt. The shoes rattle like castanets, and the long line of white-coated, blue-capped figures undulates in and out among the tree clumps, appearing, vanishing, and reappearing like some monstrous serpent in full chase after its prey. Ha! What's that? A fence right across the path? What is to be done now? The leader soon answers this question, for over the obstacle he goes as lightly as a bird, and his followers imitate him as best they may, some being content to crawl gingerly across by dint of hands and knees. One luckless wight, tripping on the top, takes a sudden header into the snowbank on the other side, leaving only a pair of legs in sight to mark the place of his downfall. But the whipper-in comes to the rescue, and soon has him on his shoes again. What between fences, hedges, ditches, and other difficulties, the line is far from being well kept up. Gaps are frequent and wide. Some have fallen and lost time in getting upright. Others have been outstripped, but the leaders, like time and tide, wait for no man, and soon the welcome lights of the clubhouse, nestling in the valley, flash cheeringly across the snow. Then the captain pauses a few minutes, that those who have been distanced may regain their places, and all being once more together, a final spurt at racing speed brings them, with shouts of joy and sighs of relief, to their goal. Here shoes are slipped off tired feet, coats and toques thrown gleefully aside, and parched mouths cooled with refreshing drinks. An hour or more is spent in rest and frolic, and then the return journey made by the well-beaten road with the shoes strapped upon the back. The distance across the mountain is nearly 3 miles, yet it has been done by an amateur in 16 minutes 28 seconds, which, considering the nature of the course, is remarkably good going. The best amateur time for 100 yards on the flat is 12½ seconds, so that, clumsy and cumbersome as the raquets may seem at first glance, they are really a very slight bar to speed when the wearer is thoroughly expert in their use. Hare and hounds on snowshoes is a sport that must commend itself to all strong and vigorous boys who have a taste for cross-country work, if only for the reason that the snowshoes make the sport possible at a time when it would otherwise be out of the question. The hare can be followed by his tracks, thus doing away with the necessity of carrying cumbrous bags of paper scent. Snowshoeing differs from many other sports in being very easy to learn. Once you have mastered the art of sliding one shoe over the other with very much the same motion that you would make in skating, instead of lifting it up high as though you were wading in deep snow, as you are sure to do at first, once you properly understand this your chief difficulty is conquered, and proficiency comes with a little practice. Throughout the length and breadth of Canada snowshoeing is popular with young and old. Every center of population has its clubs. Competitions are held every winter, at which tempting prizes are offered to the winners in races at different distances, from 100 yards up to 10 miles. End of section 15.
Section 16 of My Strange Rescue. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Strange Rescue by James Macdonald Oxley. Section 16. The Swimming Match at the Arm. Frank, hold on there a second," cried Jack Stone breathlessly as he ran after his friend. Frank halted until Jack caught up to him. "Well, Jack, what's the news? You seem to be excited about something," said he. "So I am," panted Jack, "for I've big news to tell you. Uncle William has offered a sovereign to the fellow that makes the best time swimming across the Northwest Arm. What do you think of that?" "Why, I think that's just splendid of him, and I'm going to try for one." And I too, you may be sure. And George Murray and Hal Hemming says they're going in. I was telling them about it this morning. Of course we can't all win, but the more the merrier, you know, and I think you and I will stand as good a chance as any of them." "Just about as good," assented Frank. "That is, if none of the big boys are allowed to try. Did your uncle make any rule about that?" "Of course he did," replied Jack. "Nobody over 15 can compete." "Oh, that's all right, and it's only fair too," said Frank, evidently much relieved. "Suppose we go out and have a practice this afternoon," suggested Jack. "It's so hot that the water ought to be as warm as milk." "All right," said Frank. "Just wait till I leave this parcel at the house and get a couple of towels, and then I'm with you." Accordingly, a few minutes later, the two boys, with towels in hand, were trudging toward the northwest arm, impatient to be in the water, for the sun was sending down lots of heat that summer afternoon. Frank Brookfield and Jack Stone were very great friends, had been so indeed almost from their nursery days. They got along about as well together as two boys who had each his own share of spirit and selfishness could, and although they were rivals in a good many of their boyish sports, they had a wise way of looking at the matter, for next to coming out first himself, each was eager that the other should, and consequently they had no occasion to quarrel over the result. In the science of swimming they were very evenly matched. What Jack lacked in strength, as compared with Frank, who stood an inch taller, being about made up by a superiority in style that was natural to him in everything he did. Hot as the afternoon was, they were too eager for their dip to walk slowly, and when they reached the projecting rock from which they were accustomed to bathe, Black Rock it was called, being a mass of dark rusty iron stone, they were both very warm and in a high state of perspiration. This, however, would not have mattered much if they had undressed immediately and plunged right in, but instead of doing so, they laid aside their outer clothes and then sat down to cool off, thus allowing a reaction to set in that came near to having serious consequences. When they thought they had cooled sufficiently, they finished their undressing and were ready for the water. "I've half a mind to swim clear across," said Frank, as they stood out on the end of the rock, hesitating for a moment, as all swimmers do, before diving into the cool green depths. "Better not," said Jack, who was the more cautious of the two. "You might be too tired to swim back." "Well, then, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll swim out to the middle and back again, and that'll be just the distance for the race." "All right, here goes," assented Jack. And with a plump, plump, the two boys, like two gigantic bullfrogs, went head first into the water, coming up again 3 or 4 yards away, with dripping heads and blinking eyes, and striking out vigorously toward the center of the arm. "Ah, but it's cold!" exclaimed Frank, half gasping. "You bet!" concurred Jack, very heartily. "Cold as ice! What business has the water to be so cold on such a broiling day as this?" "Oh, it's just a little way it has," said Frank. "But cold or not cold, I'm going out to the middle." And with a powerful overhand stroke he ploughed his way through the rippled brine, his shoulders gleaming white as he bent to his work. Jack, using the ordinary breast stroke, kept close up to him, and they worked too hard to do much talking until the center of the arm was reached, and they could see then the whole beautiful sheet of water from end to end. Then they paused, and Frank, saying he was beginning to feel tired, turned over on his back for a little rest, Jack forthwith imitating his example. "Sakes alive, but this water is cold!" cried Jack. "If we stay in it much longer, we'll be getting the cramps. Let's make for the shore." "All right, go ahead. I'm after you," replied Frank. Jack accordingly turned his face shoreward, and trying the side stroke now, was making pretty good progress. Having got about halfway in, when a cry from Frank, who was a few yards behind, made him stop suddenly and wheel round to see what was the matter. "Come here, Jack," said Frank in a troubled voice, and Jack immediately went back to him. "What's the matter, old chap?" asked he anxiously. "Why," answered Frank, I seem to be losing all my strength. See, I can hardly take a stroke." And sure enough, his strength seemed to have left him, and instead of the wide, powerful sweeps he usually made, he could manage to do little more than paddle enough with his hands to keep his head afloat. The fact of the matter was that he had been seized with muscular cramp, and was in great danger, for there was no boat in sight, and the shore lay nearly 50 yards away, with water deep enough between to swallow an ocean steamer. Jack fully realized the danger, but was too sensible to say so. Taking a firm grasp of Frank's right shoulder with his left hand, he said cheerily, "Come along now, I'll give you a lift." And then, putting forth all his strength, he pushed Frank forward, while the latter could just manage to keep his head above water and pointed in the right direction. In this fashion they crept slowly along, Frank growing more helpless and Jack more tired every yard. Frank now could not even keep his mouth above water, for the deadly cramp was drawing him all together, his back being bent like a bow, and his arms and legs contracted until they were almost altogether useless. Jack too began to feel the cruel cold fastening upon him, and his strength departing from him. His heart sank as he looked at the distance still ahead, and felt himself weakening at every stroke. In his extremity the temptation to let go of Frank and strike for the shore alone even flashed into his mind, only to be contemptuously dismissed with a silent resolution to stay by his friend, whatever happened. At length, by dint of grim determination, Jack got Frank within 10 yards of the shore, and then, feeling as though any further effort on his part were impossible, he gave his friend a big push forward, saying, "Now then, Frank, do the rest yourself." With a muffled, half-finished cry of, "For heaven's sake, Jack!" poor Frank, utterly helpless, went under, half turning over on his back as he did so. Not for a moment did Jack hesitate. Weak and chilled as he was, the sight of his playmate's peril nerved him to fresh exertions, and summoning all his energies for one supreme final effort, he grasped Frank's shoulders once more, and with desperate spasmodic strokes fought his way through the water. Never will he forget that wrestle with death. Frank, fortunately still keeping collected and quiet, could get but an occasional breath, for now nearly his whole face was submerged, and Jack himself seemed to be swimming in some dense fluid that stubbornly opposed the movements of his arms. But foot by foot he struggled on, until at length, when every atom of strength and hope seemed exhausted, he saw below him the dark seaweed-covered rock, and putting down his foot, found solid bottom beneath him. "Thank the merciful Father, we're saved, Frank!" he cried, half sobbingly, as he drew his companion up on to the rock. "God bless you, Jack! You've saved my life," replied Frank, with a fervour that showed how clearly he understood the magnitude of the peril through which he had passed. "Yes, Jack, you've saved my life, and some day I'll show you how grateful I am." "Oh, that's all right," said Jack. "You'd do the same for me if you had the chance." "I hope I won't have the chance all the same," answered Frank, "for perhaps I wouldn't keep as cool as you did, and then where would we be?" Half an hour's basking in the hot sun took all the cramp out of the boys' bodies, and they went back home not a whit the worse for their experience, and a good deal wiser. They kept the matter to themselves, prudently thinking it would only alarm their parents if it came to their ears, and perhaps make them worry, while really there was no occasion for further anxiety. The following Saturday afternoon was the time fixed for the swimming race, and the two friends practised diligently, determined that the sovereign should fall to one of them at all events, or perhaps be divided between them if they came out a tie. The eagerly anticipated day dawned sunnily, and proved as fine, bright, and warm as heart could wish. A great deal of interest was felt in the swimming race, for at least 6 boys had entered for it, and in the afternoon the Arm, at the place where the swimming would take place, was dotted over with boats, containing the fathers, mothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, and friends of the different contestants. Uncle William, or to give him his proper title, Mr. William Cunard, was the judge at the finish, and the 6 boys, wearing the scantiest possible bathing suits, were rowed across to the other side of the arm in boats. "I'm awfully excited," said Jack Stone to Frank Brookfield on the way over in so low a tone that none of the other boys heard him. "Father says he'll double the prize if I win, but if I don't win, I hope to goodness you will." "Whoever wins will have a hard fight for it," said Frank. "Both George and Hal can swim like fishes. I don't know about the other 2. Presently the boat touched the shore, and the boys all leaped out and took up their positions upon the ledge of rock from which they were to start. "Are you ready?" called out the starter. "Then go!" And with a tremendous splash the whole 6 plunged into the water like one man. The next moment they were all at the surface again and cleaving the calm water at the top of their speed. Frank was using his favourite overhand stroke, Jack the side stroke, and the rest the ordinary breast stroke. For some distance there was little difference between them. You might have covered them with a handkerchief, so to speak. Then little by little Frank and Jack, keeping well together, began to draw away from George and Hal, who in their turn led the other 2. By the time the centre of the arm was reached, it was plain to all that the race lay between the 2 friends, and amid cheers and shouts of "Go it, Frank!" "Hit her up, Jack!" "Pretty work, both of you!" "Keep it up!" they ploughed through the water side by side. 3/4 of the distance was now covered, and their positions were unchanged, when with a pang that went right to his heart, Jack felt himself weakening. Inch by inch his stroke shortened, and first Frank's head, then his neck, and then his shoulders slipped past him. Gritting his teeth with fierce determination, and breathing hard, he strained every nerve to recover his lost ground, but all in vain. Frank gained steadily until his heels were in a line with Jack's head. Already they were raising the shouts of victory, when Frank, turning to see what lead he had, caught sight of Jack's pale face, in which disappointment and despair were already showing themselves, and it brought up in his mind that same face a week before, when, pallid but resolute just as it was now, it cut the water close beside him, while the boy to whom it belonged struggled so bravely with the death that threatened. A mist came in his eyes, and a lump rose in his throat as he thought of this. "He saved my life," he murmured to himself. "Hello, what's up with Frank?" said Mr. Cunard. "He's almost stopped. He must be done out. Just shove out that boat there toward him, will you?" "Go on and win, old chap," said Frank to Jack, when the latter came up to him. "I'm used up. I'll just paddle in slowly. Oh, I'm all right," he added, as Jack showed signs of stopping to help him. "Tired out, that's all." Cheer after cheer rang out as Jack, nearly exhausted himself, but undaunted in spirit, swept by Frank, now paddling quite leisurely, and finished the course amidst a general chorus of congratulation. He felt as proud as Punch, and when Frank came ashore, threw his arms around him affectionately, saying, "You're a dear good fellow to let me beat you." Not that he had the slightest suspicion as to how it had really happened. Frank never told him. Indeed, he never told anybody except his mother, and she alone of all the people who witnessed it knew the secret of Frank Brookfield's sudden collapse in the swimming match at the Arm. End of section 16. Section 17 of My Strange Rescue. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Strange Rescue by James Macdonald Oxley. Section 17. Harold's Lasting Impression. "Harold! Harold! Harold!" cried Mrs. Owen at the top of her clear, strong voice. her anxiety increasing as no answer came back. "Mercy on me! What can have become of that boy? As sure as anything he's gone down to the wharf again, and after all that I have said to him, too. I do wish something would make a lasting impression upon him." And with a feeling of uneasiness she could not shake off, the troubled mother went back to her housework, sighing over her boy's disobedience. Now Harold Owen was not really a bad boy. He loved his mother dearly, and always felt sorry when he had grieved her, but he was such a thoughtless little chap. 8 years old last October, stout, cheery, and brave, full to overflowing of animal spirits, eager to do everything he saw the older boys doing, and always wanting to be with them, quite as heedless and forgetful as he was affectionate and obliging. Sturdy little Hal was just the kind of boy to make a mother whose only child he was no less anxious than proud about him. And in these lovely summer days, when nobody wanted to be indoors between daylight and dark, except to eat their meals, poor Mrs. Owen had her hands full in trying to keep track of her son, who would stray off in spite of her orders to stay near home. You see, Harold did not just mean to flatly disobey his mother. For days together he would do exactly what she told him, and make her very happy. But every now and then some of the boys in the neighbourhood, Jack Hardy perhaps, or Frank Lawson, would come along and get talking with Hal over the garden fence, and as sure as they did, it ended in the little fellow's forgetting all about his mother's commands and going off to the wharves, where sometimes he stayed so long as to give his mother quite a fright. That was exactly what had happened this glorious July morning, when Mrs. Owen, missing her boy's shouts from the front garden, ran out to the door, her bare arms all white with flour, for she had been making a cake, and called, "Harold, Harold, Harold," so loud that you might have heard her halfway down to the wharves. If indeed she could have been heard all the way down, perhaps her call might have brought Harold back, and in that case he should not have got his lasting impression, and I would have had no story to tell. But just at this time our little man was altogether too much taken up with what Jack Hardy was telling him to hear anything less noisy than a steam engine. "I'll bet my boots, Hal, you never saw such a funny little chap in your life. He's about as big as our baby, but nothing like so fat, and he has long hair all over him, over his face too. And he jumps around and talks away at the fellows, and sits up on his hind legs to eat nuts and crackers. Oh, I tell you, he's lots of fun." This was part of Jack's account of a very interesting monkey belonging to the black cook of a large ship then at the wharf, and it was the promise of showing him this monkey. What 8-year-old boy could resist such a temptation? That had lured Hal away from home. Down to the wharf they ran as fast as their legs could carry them, and there they found a half-dozen other youngsters, much about their own age, all evidently bent on the same errand. The stately Roseneath lay right across the end of the wharf, and was being fed with long, yellow, sweet-smelling deals that would make houses in England some day. The boys stood for a while watching the huge planks sliding through the bow ports into the dark, mysterious hold, and then there was a general rush for the stern, where they expected to find the rope ladder by which they would climb on board. But much to their disappointment, no ladder could they see, and no way of climbing up except a thick rope that dangled over the side, reaching quite down to the wharf. The truth of the matter being that the sailors, getting rather tired of the boys' frequent invasions, had taken away the ladder and put the rope in its place, thinking thus to put a stop to their coming on board. The tide was high, and the great black hull of the ship towered above the wharf like the side of a house. The boys looked pretty blank at first, but then you know it takes a good deal to stop an enterprising boy when his heart is set on anything, and presently, after a little talk together, Jack Hardy said he would see if he couldn't shin up the rope. So he clasped the rope tight in his brown fists, twined his strong legs around it, and up he went. Not very fast, to be sure, but gaining a bit at every wriggle, until at last he reached the bulwarks, and the boys gave him a cheer as he called out, "Come along, fellows, it's not so hard. You can all do it." Frank Lawson tried next, and he got up all right. Then Charlie Wright followed, and now Master Harold thought he would try his luck. So too did Jim Norton. And when Harold got the rope first, it made Jim so cross that, like the rough, heedless chap he was, he gave Hal an angry push, just as the little man had let go from the wharf and was clinging to the rope. Of course, Jim did not really mean any harm, but he came pretty near doing dreadful harm all the same, for his push was such a hard one that it loosened unlucky little Hal's hold upon the rope, and with a cry of fright, down he dropped between the vessel and the wharf, falling with a great splash into the dark green water. Poor little Hal! You may well wish you had not disobeyed your mother's orders, for now there is small chance of your ever being able to disobey them again. The tide had begun to run out, and although Harold struggled up to the surface twice, so that his terrified playmates caught a glimpse of his pale, frightened face for a moment, the cruel current dragged him down again, and the horrid salt water rushed into his mouth as he opened it to cry for help. His father had given him some lessons in swimming that summer, and he tried to put them in practice now, striking out bravely with his plump fists and sturdy legs. But of course such swimming as that could not help him, and he sank deeper and deeper. And then at last he gave up trying to save himself. He lost all sense of suffering, and as he drifted passively away with the current, a strange thing happened to him, something that he will never forget though he lives 100 years, and it was this. All his past life appeared before his mind in a series of pictures, in fact, just like the panorama of the American Rebellion he had enjoyed the winter before. All his doings, good and bad, but more particularly the bad ones, seemed to come up clearly before him, and as he saw what a naughty, thoughtless boy he had been, he felt sorry enough never to disobey his dear, fond mother again. But wasn't it too late now? What? Up in the sunshine once more, and sitting on the solid yellow deals, with his companions crowding round him, laughing and crying and patting him on the back, and acting so comically, while all the time the water is dripping down off his clothes and making a puddle at his feet, and he does feel so uncomfortable underneath his blouse. And who is that big strong man standing near, just as wet as himself, and looking at him with his handsome bronzed face full of pride and pleasure? And isn't that his father, coming down the wharf as hard as he can run, with face so white that he looks like a ghost? Bewildered little Hal couldn't at first understand what it all meant, and when his father, catching him up in his arms, pressed him passionately to his breast, the little man just burst out crying, and hid his wet face on his father's shoulder. In this fashion he went back home, the boys following in a triumphal procession. An hour afterwards, when Master Harold had got rid of the uncomfortable feeling under his blouse, and put on a warm, dry suit of clothes, Jack Hardy told him how, when he fell plump into the water, the boys had all shouted out for help, and how the mate of the Roseneath had sprung out of his cabin at the first cry, and, directed by Jack, without waiting even to take off his coat, had dived right down into the deep dark water. How he had come up once without finding Hal, and after taking breath had gone down a second time in search of him. How he had hunted around in the water until at last, seeing something black below him, he had stretched down his leg, and his toe catching Hal under the chin, the gallant mate drew him up into his arms, and then made for the daylight. And how, when Harold first came out of the water, he seemed to be dead, but in a few minutes came to life again, and sat up, blinking his eyes like a young baby. All this and more too did Jack Hardy, proud of having such an audience, for besides Mr. and Mrs. Owen, a dozen or more of the neighbours had run in to hear all about it, relate with great gusto. and as Harold realized how very near he had come to losing his life, and looked into his darling mother's face, streaming with tears of joy and gratitude, which but for the brave sailor would have been tears of bitter sorrow, he gathered up his little features into a most determined expression, and said, "Mother, I'll never disobey you again." Thus did his mother get her wish, and Master Harold his lasting impression, which many a time saved him from falling again into disobedience. End of Section 17.